The mall was bustling with the kind of energy that only a busy San Francisco afternoon could produce. Shoppers navigating between high-end boutiques, the hum of escalators rising and falling, the air heavy with the scent of fresh coffee and designer perfumes. Eleanor tried to ignore the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her purse, standing beside Catherine near a window display, admiring a pair of sparkling earrings. "It's getting late, Eleanor." Catherine's voice cut through the din of the mall, laced with a barely concealed impatience. Eleanor turned, blinking at her daughter-in-law, who had been unnervingly quiet for the last hour. Catherine was always the picture of composure, but tonight there was an edge to her politeness, something Eleanor couldn't quite place. "I'm almost done here," Eleanor murmured, glancing around at the clothes, the jewelry, the bustling shoppers, all of it too overwhelming for her. She wasn't accustomed to this world of excess, and it made her feel like an outsider. But she'd tried to be part of it, for David's sake, for the family. Catherine sighed, an exaggerated sound meant for Eleanor to hear. "I'll be back in a minute. I just need to grab something quickly. David will stay with you." David, who had been pacing on his phone a few feet away, didn't even look up as Catherine spoke. He had always been distant, wrapped up in his own world of work and technology, but something about tonight felt different. The coolness between them was palpable, like a distant memory resurfacing, a reminder of how his life had become so separate from hers. "I'll just wait here," Eleanor replied, trying to hold her ground. She'd learned, over the years, that it was easier to blend into the background, easier to be invisible than to fight for a place at the table. Catherine didn't even acknowledge her as she turned and walked off, disappearing into the crowd. David glanced at Eleanor with a quick, distracted smile, but didn't stop his phone conversation. She nodded and sat on a nearby bench, feeling a strange weight settle in her chest. Her mind wandered, but soon, the minutes turned to an hour. The cold air outside the glass doors brushed in with every person that entered or left the mall. Eleanor glanced at her phone. No messages, no calls. She told herself Catherine would be back soon. Maybe she was just caught in a store, picking out something she'd forgotten. But soon, the passing time felt like an accusation. 2 hours. 3. She stood up, her legs sore from the marble floors, and wandered towards the restroom, hoping the movement might ease the tightness in her chest. The flush of the restroom door opening and closing only added to her sense of isolation. It wasn't just the physical coldness of the mall, it was the growing realization that her family, the people she had loved and supported, had somehow drifted away without her noticing. "Where are they?" she muttered to herself as she stared at her phone again. No texts, no missed calls. Something was off. The pit in her stomach deepened. The hours crept on, each minute an unwelcome reminder of how alone she truly was. She tried to call David, then Catherine, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Panic began to gnaw at her, an emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel. But tonight, it was all-encompassing. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Eleanor walked toward the exit, hoping to catch a glimpse of them in the parking lot. But the evening had settled, the sky dark and unforgiving. The crowd had thinned, and the mall felt like a cavernous echo of her humiliation. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the wind cutting through the empty spaces between her and the outside world. A cab ride back to her house was all she could manage. She didn't want to risk waiting any longer, only to be further exposed to the coldness that seemed to settle into her bones. As the cab hummed through the streets, Eleanor sank into the seat, the tears she had been holding back finally stinging her eyes. This wasn't just about being left behind in a mall. It was about being left behind in her own life, by her own son and daughter-in-law. She knew this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it was the first time it had felt so clear, so deliberate. She wasn't wanted. Not here. Not anywhere. When the cab pulled up to her house, she paid the driver without a word, the heavy weight of the silence pressing down on her. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, hoping for some shred of comfort, but found only an empty home. The house she'd shared with Robert was now just a reminder of everything that had slipped away. And then, as she shut the door behind her, Eleanor realized this wasn't just a moment of abandonment. This was the beginning of something much deeper, something she had never truly wanted to face. The funeral had been a blur, the steady procession of mourners, the hushed whispers, the flowers that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. Each one a reminder of how many people had once loved Robert. Eleanor stood at the back of the room, hands clasped tightly together, trying to maintain a calm facade. The grief was there, raw and jagged, but it was also buried under something else, something darker, something she hadn't yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge. The estate, the house, Robert's money. She'd never thought much about any of it. She had always considered herself rich in family, in memories, in the simple things that mattered. But now, standing here, the weight of responsibility bore down on her. This wasn't just about the loss of Robert. This was about the legacy he had left behind, the people who would inherit it, and the new reality she was facing. A week later, they gathered in the sleek, modern conference room of the family lawyer's office. Eleanor sat at the long, polished table, the mahogany surface gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Catherine sat beside her, impeccably put together as always, though Eleanor could sense a tension in her posture, a tightness to her smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. David, as usual, was distracted. His attention flickered between his phone and the papers in front of him. Eleanor, though, couldn't help but focus on the lawyer, Mr. Nolan, who was preparing to read Robert's will. She sat up straighter, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for what she already knew would be a life-changing moment. "Let's begin," Mr. Nolan said, clearing his throat. "To my beloved wife Eleanor, I leave the house we shared, as well as the majority of my financial assets, including the investments and savings accounts I've built over the years." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of the house, the place she had lived with Robert for so many years. It was more than just bricks and mortar to her. It was the place where their lives had unfolded, where she had cared for him, loved him. Her heart ached at the thought of having it all to herself now. The lawyer continued, "To my son David and my daughter-in-law Catherine, I leave a portion of the estate, including several investments and a portion of my savings." Eleanor watched as David gave a small nod, his face unreadable. Catherine, however, tensed beside him, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "And lastly," Mr. Nolan's voice dropped slightly, as if the words were weighted with some greater significance, "I leave a substantial donation to the Redwood Foundation, a charity that has always meant a great deal to me and my family." Eleanor blinked in surprise. The Redwood Foundation. She had spent years organizing fundraisers, quietly supporting the cause that helped at-risk youth. Robert had always been supportive of her efforts, but she never expected him to leave such a significant sum to it. Her heart fluttered with a mix of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and pride. But Catherine's reaction was immediate. Her jaw tightened and she shot a glance at David. "A charity?" she scoffed. "That's just absurd." Eleanor turned to her daughter-in-law, surprised by the venom in her voice. But Catherine wasn't done. She straightened in her chair, her gaze now fixed on Eleanor. "This will is completely unfair," Catherine said, her voice rising with frustration. "Why should some charity get more than David and I? We're family. We've been here for years. Robert's own son." David remained silent, his eyes glued to his phone screen. Eleanor's stomach churned at the way Catherine spoke. Unfair? She had thought the charity donation would be a beautiful gesture, one that honored Robert's values. But Catherine's tone made it clear she saw nothing but an obstacle that had taken money away from her. Eleanor could feel the blood drain from her face as Catherine turned her full attention to her. "You may need legal counsel, Eleanor," Catherine added, the words dripping with a false sweetness. "You might want to look into this. I don't think Robert had full mental clarity when he wrote this. I'm sure there's a way to adjust things." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. The coldness in Catherine's words was unmistakable. Eleanor felt as though the room had suddenly grown colder and her breath caught in her throat. Was Catherine really suggesting they contest the will? To go after the charity? To dismantle the legacy Robert had left behind? David finally looked up from his phone, but it was too late. The damage had been done. "Mom," he said, his voice distant. "I think Catherine's right. You might want to consider getting a lawyer to go over this. I know this wasn't what you were expecting, but, well, you know how things work." His words, though polite, felt hollow to Eleanor. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't speak. She didn't want to hear what was coming next, didn't want to hear the bitterness creeping into their voices. Her son had always been distant, but this was different. This was a line being drawn in the sand. Catherine smiled, but it was a smile full of calculation. "We'll handle this carefully, won't we, Eleanor?" she said, leaning back in her chair. "Don't worry, I'm sure we can fix it." Eleanor felt the room close in on her. The weight of betrayal had never felt so sharp. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about power, control. Catherine wasn't just after Robert's wealth. She was after Eleanor's place in the family. And David? He was already slipping through her fingers, pulled toward his wife's ambitions, unable or unwilling to see the truth. As the lawyer began to speak again, outlining the next steps, Eleanor's mind raced. She had spent years taking care of everyone, but now it was clear that no one would fight for her. The charity that Robert had so generously supported was under attack. Her own family was turning against her, and all she could do was sit there, silent, as the life she knew slowly slipped from her grasp. And in that silence, Eleanor understood. This was no longer about grief. This was about survival. The first letter came 2 weeks after the reading of the will. Eleanor sat in the quiet of her living room, the weight of Robert's absence still fresh, when she saw the envelope, heavy, official-looking, land on the table. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, a sinking feeling taking hold in her stomach. The words blurred as she read them, but the message was unmistakable. Catherine's lawyer, Stephen Bradley, had filed a lawsuit against her. The lawsuit claimed Eleanor was unfairly left the majority of the estate, and that the will should be contested. The accusation was absurd, but the numbers were real. Catherine was seeking a sum of $2.7 million, arguing that the distribution had been manipulated, essentially accusing Eleanor of coercing Robert into leaving her the lion's share. Eleanor couldn't breathe. Her fingers gripped the letter tighter, her eyes scanning it over and over. Catherine, of all people. The woman who had come into their lives with a smile and a polished facade. A woman who now seemed determined to tear everything Eleanor had known apart. She felt as though the world was closing in on her. The room felt too small, the walls pressing inward, her chest tight. David had known nothing about this. He was the one person she had hoped would be her anchor, her ally in this storm. But now it felt like he had slipped further away. He hadn't even called since the reading of the will. Eleanor's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence. It was David. "Mom, I just saw the papers," he said, his voice low, hesitant. "I think Catherine's right. It just doesn't seem fair." The words stung, each one a sharp jab. Eleanor felt the warmth in her chest falter. her breath coming out in a shaky exhale. Fair? Her mind raced back to the will, back to Robert's wishes. The will had been clear. She hadn't manipulated anyone. She hadn't done anything wrong. But David was already siding with Catherine. He wasn't the same son she had once known. "I'm not involved, Mom," David continued, the silence between them stretching long. "I don't want to get caught in the middle of this. You need to figure this out with Catherine, not me." Eleanor could feel the sharp pang of betrayal settle into her bones. He was distancing himself, wrapping himself in Catherine's world and leaving her to fight this alone. She hung up the phone, her throat tight, and let out a long, shaky breath. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, she contacted Robert Kelly, a respected attorney she'd heard of through mutual friends. Robert Kelly wasn't just any lawyer. He was known for his sharp wit, his skill at turning the tide in seemingly impossible cases. She didn't have the luxury of time. The lawsuit was already in motion, and Eleanor would not back down without a fight. Robert Kelly's office was sleek and modern, located in the heart of the city, the glass windows offering a sweeping view of the skyline. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded tightly on her lap. She could feel the tension in her body, the weight of the decision she was about to make pressing on her shoulders. "I know you're in a difficult position," Robert said, his voice calm but firm. "But you have a case. We can win this." Eleanor looked at him, uncertain. She had never been a woman to fight publicly, to put herself out there in front of the world. She had always kept to the background, silently supporting Robert, their son, the family. But now, it seemed, that silence was no longer an option. The media quickly caught wind of the legal battle. The whispers grew louder, the headlines more sensational. "Widow faces $2.7 million lawsuit from daughter-in-law over will," screamed one tabloid. "Billionaire's estate in chaos, family at war," said another. Eleanor's life, which had once been private and quiet, was now fodder for public consumption. The constant barrage of phone calls, reporters on her doorstep, and paparazzi hounding her at every turn was enough to make her dizzy. She wanted to retreat, to crawl into the shell she had so carefully built over the years, but there was no going back. She had to face this. She had to fight. Eleanor stepped out of her house one morning, her coat pulled tightly around her as she braced for another day of cameras flashing and reporters yelling her name. Her face was calm, composed, but inside she was a storm of emotions: rage, sadness, disbelief. It was like living in a nightmare, where the people she had loved most were the ones trying to destroy her. As she walked past the line of cameras, one reporter yelled, "Is it true that you manipulated Robert into leaving you the estate? How do you feel about your son turning his back on you?" The words hit her like a slap. Eleanor turned to face them, her expression unwavering. "I did nothing wrong," she said, her voice steady, though her insides churned. "This is a battle for what's right, not just for me, but for Robert's legacy." The reporters pushed forward, but Eleanor kept walking, her heels clicking on the pavement, a steady beat of resolve. The weight of everything she had lost, her family, her peace, pressed down on her. But there was something else in the air now. Something fierce, something burning. She wasn't going to let Catherine tear everything apart. She wasn't going to let her son turn his back on her. The fight had started, and Eleanor wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As she stepped into her car, her phone buzzed again. A message from David. "Mom, I hope you understand that I'm doing this for our family. Catherine has made it clear that this is what's best for all of us." Eleanor's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked out the window, the city sprawling beneath her, feeling both small and invincible at the same time. This wasn't just about money. It was about something far more important: her dignity, her legacy. And she wasn't going to let it be destroyed without a fight. The walls of Eleanor's home had never seemed so oppressive, the stillness of the room suffocating. As the days passed, the weight of Catherine's lawsuit bore down on her, each new document arriving with a fresh round of accusations and demands. She tried to focus, but the noise, both literal and emotional, felt relentless. It wasn't just the legal battle that drained her. It was the deeper betrayal, the realization that the woman she had once welcomed into the family had been hiding her true nature all along. Eleanor had always known Catherine as polished, meticulous, even a little cold. But she had never suspected the depths of manipulation Catherine was capable of. There had to be more to the story. Determined to uncover the truth, Eleanor enlisted the help of Robert Kelly, her lawyer, to dig into Catherine's past. She wasn't going to let her tarnish Robert's memory and take what was rightfully hers. "Let's start with her history," Robert said one afternoon, his calm demeanor a contrast to the storm Eleanor felt brewing inside her. "It's time we find out who we're really dealing with." The investigation wasn't easy. Catherine's public persona was as polished as ever. Successful, elegant, the perfect wife to David. But behind the facade, Robert's team began to uncover a different picture. Old friends, colleagues, even distant relatives, all of them had a similar story. Catherine's relationships were always transactional. She had burned bridges at every turn, discarded people when they no longer served her needs. It became clear that Catherine's primary motivation wasn't love or loyalty. It was power, status, and money. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she learned more. Catherine had been married before, and in that marriage, she had taken every opportunity to manipulate her ex-husband into giving her what she wanted, using charm and deceit to bend him to her will. But when the marriage ended, Catherine had left him with nothing, taking everything she could. The trail of manipulation and betrayal was undeniable. "She's been doing this for years," Robert said one evening, leaning back in his chair, his tone cold. "Catherine doesn't care about family, she cares about winning." Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't just angry, she was determined. She couldn't let Catherine destroy everything Robert had worked for. The estate wasn't just about money, it was about preserving their lives together, their memories, and Robert's legacy. Eleanor wasn't going to let a woman like Catherine tarnish that. As the legal battle continued, the tension between Eleanor and David grew. He had refused to step in, refusing to take a stand against his wife. The few times Eleanor had tried to speak with him, he deflected, offering little more than vague reassurances. It was clear he wasn't willing to see Catherine for who she truly was, and it was beginning to hurt more than Eleanor was willing to admit. "I'm just trying to keep the peace," David told her one afternoon, his face pale, his eyes downcast. "You're both on opposite sides of this. I don't want to get involved." Eleanor's heart cracked, but she said nothing. What was the point? She had raised him, loved him, and this was how he repaid her, by choosing Catherine over his own mother. "Do what you need to do, Mom," he added, his voice strained. "But I'm not taking sides." The pain of that moment sat like a stone in Eleanor's chest. How could he do this? How could her own son stand by while Catherine ripped their family apart? The media, of course, didn't help. As the case gained traction, the tabloids grew more salacious, digging deeper into her personal life. They painted Eleanor as a vengeful widow, someone desperate to hold on to her late husband's fortune. Every new headline seemed to twist the truth more than the last, but Eleanor refused to let the lies define her. She would fight, no matter what the world thought of her. It wasn't until a late-night call that Eleanor truly understood the depths of the fight she was facing. "I need to tell you something." Robert Kelly's voice was low, urgent. "Catherine's lawyer, Bradley, is starting to play dirty. He's been feeding the press a narrative that you've been manipulating the situation, telling them Robert was in poor health when he wrote the will, that he wasn't of sound mind." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She had known Catherine would do anything to win, but this was an all-out assault on her integrity, on her late husband's honor. They were trying to rewrite history, to paint Eleanor as the villain, the woman who had manipulated Robert in his final days. "Do we have evidence to fight this?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with fury. "We're working on it," Robert replied, "but they're going to go after you personally. They've already started trying to discredit your reputation." Eleanor hung up, the phone trembling in her hand. Her mind raced with images of Catherine, so sweet and polished on the surface, but underneath, a master manipulator. She wasn't just trying to take money, she was trying to destroy Eleanor, to erase her from the family narrative. Eleanor walked over to the window, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The city sprawled before her, indifferent to her pain. But something inside her had shifted. She wasn't going to let Catherine win. She couldn't. "I won't let you take everything from me," Eleanor whispered to the empty room. With renewed determination, Eleanor returned to her research, every discovery about Catherine's past adding fuel to her fire. She would not allow this woman to rewrite their family history. Eleanor had loved Robert, built a life with him, and now she would fight to make sure his legacy and her own were protected. The truth was out there, and Eleanor was going to find it. But she knew, deep down, that Catherine's attempt to destroy her was just beginning. The battle for her family's future was far from over, and Eleanor was ready. The weight of the lawsuit pressed on Eleanor's chest with every passing hour. Catherine had gone too far, too low, and Eleanor was done hiding in the shadows. She couldn't sit by any longer, letting the media churn out lie after lie, painting her as a gold-digging widow. She would fight back, but not in the way Catherine expected. With Robert Kelly's guidance, Eleanor crafted a strategy that would turn the tide. She would go public. No more silence. No more being the victim in a story written by Catherine's lies. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. The day Eleanor released her statement, she felt a strange calm. She stood in front of her vanity, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who stared back at her was different, stronger, more resolute. "This is not who I am," she thought, "but it's who I have to be now." The statement was clear, concise, and most importantly, truthful. Eleanor laid bare the facts about Catherine's history, detailing her manipulative behavior in past relationships and her desperate, self-serving actions. She didn't hold back. There was no room for ambiguity. If Catherine wanted to drag her through the mud, Eleanor would expose her for the fraud she was. The press exploded. Headlines flashed across the screens. "Widow fights back. Eleanor Hughes speaks out against alleged manipulation," and "Catherine's greed exposed. Widow's public statement paints daughter-in-law as villain." Within hours, Catherine's public image began to crack. No longer the poised, perfect wife, she was now seen as a ruthless, power-hungry manipulator, using her marriage to David as a pawn in her quest for wealth. It didn't take long for the public's sympathy to shift. Eleanor's story resonated with so many who had been on the receiving end of family betrayal, the heartbreak of watching someone they loved turn into someone unrecognizable. Messages of support flooded in. Letters, calls, and social media posts from strangers who admired her strength. It was overwhelming, and yet, it was exactly what she needed. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that she was fighting for more than just herself. But Catherine wasn't backing down. She shot back with a statement of her own, accusing Eleanor of being vindictive, of trying to destroy her family's happiness out of spite. Catherine played the victim, just as Eleanor had known she would. But this time, the narrative had shifted. The public was starting to see through her. They were tired of the image Catherine had painted of herself. and they were beginning to question her motives. Behind the scenes, Eleanor's legal team worked tirelessly to gather evidence. Robert Kelly's strategy was simple but effective. Use Catherine's own actions against her. He presented financial records that showed Catherine's reckless spending habits, evidence that painted her as someone willing to do anything to maintain her lavish lifestyle, no matter the cost to those around her. The numbers didn't lie. Credit card statements, bank transfers, luxury purchases, each one more damning than the last. Eleanor felt a growing sense of satisfaction as Robert laid out the facts. Catherine had not only squandered her own money, but had attempted to siphon funds from Robert's estate, hiding assets and inflating debts. The woman was a master of deceit, but the cracks in her armor were widening. David, on the other hand, felt the pressure mounting. The more Catherine defended herself, the more Eleanor's truth came to light. The relationship between David and his wife began to falter under the weight of the accusations. David's posture shifted in court, his eyes avoiding Eleanor's as the evidence against Catherine grew undeniable. But still, he defended her, his voice low and almost apologetic. "Catherine is just confused," David said, his voice strained during a rare conversation between the two. "She doesn't know what she's doing. I'm doing this for the family, Mom. You need to understand that." Eleanor didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She had tried for years to hold on to the son she knew, but now it was clear that the man before her was a stranger, one who had chosen the side of a woman who cared for nothing but power. The courtroom battles raged on. Each day, Eleanor walked into the courthouse with a new resolve, her head held high, her spine straight. Catherine's lawyer, Stephen Bradley, became more desperate, lashing out with baseless accusations, trying to shift the narrative once again. He accused Eleanor of having ulterior motives, of intentionally sabotaging David's relationship with his wife. He even suggested that Eleanor was somehow responsible for Robert's declining health in his final days, but Robert Kelly was ready for him. He had anticipated this move, and with each new attempt to discredit Eleanor, Robert would pull out another piece of evidence that made Catherine's case crumble even further. At one point, Robert used Catherine's own words, recorded during a private meeting with her lawyer, to completely dismantle her defense. In the recording, Catherine had openly discussed ways to manipulate Robert's will, admitting to trying to pressure him into changing it in her favor. The courtroom was silent as the tape played. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. This was the proof that Catherine had tried to bury. Her true nature, her greed, her lies, was finally exposed for all to see. Catherine's face drained of color as she heard her own voice echoing in the courtroom. Her perfectly crafted persona cracked, and the public began to turn away from her. David's hand clenched at his side, his jaw tight. He had no words. There was nothing left for him to say. Eleanor stood at the center of it all, knowing the battle wasn't over yet, but feeling a strange sense of triumph rise within her. The truth was on her side, and it was becoming impossible for anyone to ignore. But just as the momentum seemed to shift in Eleanor's favor, a new message arrived, a twist she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed and the notification read, "Catherine files for divorce from David, claims emotional distress from ongoing legal battle." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The war was far from over. Catherine wasn't done yet. The days after Catherine filed for divorce were an unsettling mix of victory and dread. Eleanor's phone buzzed nonstop, calls from the media, concerned friends, even strangers offering support. The public was on her side, but Catherine's legal team was relentless, trying to spin the story into something it wasn't. The divorce was nothing more than a calculated move, a smokescreen designed to distract from the mounting evidence of Catherine's greed. But Eleanor was done being passive. She would take control of this fight, not just for herself, but for Robert's legacy. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table one morning, the walls around her lined with memories of Robert. His laughter, his presence. Everything was now a distant echo. But she wasn't going to let his name be dragged through the mud, and she wasn't going to let Catherine win. The court case, the media, her family. Everything was escalating, but Eleanor knew the truth. And truth, she realized, was the weapon she had yet to wield fully. Her lawyer, Robert Kelly, had been relentless in the investigation. Every new piece of evidence he uncovered only made Catherine's actions more egregious. The financial records, the luxury spending, the hidden bank accounts, it was all there. But the final blow came one morning when Robert's assistant uncovered a new document buried deep in Robert's estate files. It was a letter Catherine had written to one of Robert's business partners months before his death. In it, she explicitly outlined her desire to control the estate, to manipulate Robert's will to ensure she received a larger share. She had even suggested that David be convinced to side with her, playing on his guilt and emotional ties. When Robert shared the letter with Eleanor, it was as though the final puzzle piece clicked into place. This wasn't just about money, it had always been about power. Catherine had used David as a pawn to gain access to Robert's wealth, to make sure she could control everything, from his estate to his family. The realization hit Eleanor hard, but it also steeled her resolve. As the case moved forward, Catherine's once confident stance began to crumble. The evidence against her was irrefutable. She had overstepped, thinking she could manipulate Eleanor, her son, and the system. But now the truth was clear to everyone, and Catherine was losing her grip on the narrative. David, too, was starting to feel the weight of his decisions. He had long distanced himself from Eleanor, caught in the web Catherine had spun around him. But as the evidence mounted, as Catherine's manipulations became undeniable, David found himself facing a truth he could no longer ignore. In a rare moment of confrontation, David approached Eleanor one evening, his face drawn with exhaustion. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his usual bravado was gone. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. "I didn't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't see it. All these years, I've been blind." He looked at his mother, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw a flicker of the son she once knew. "I was just trying to protect my marriage, Mom. I thought I was doing what was best for us. But now I can see what Catherine has done. She's been using me, using us, from the start." Eleanor's heart ached, but she held her ground. She had fought for so long, had endured so much, but she wasn't going to break now. She hadn't asked for David's apologies. He had made his choices, but this was a moment of reckoning, and it wasn't for her to forgive him. It was for him to understand the damage he'd caused. "David, I love you," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady. "But Catherine doesn't love you. She never did. She wanted to control you, to control everything, and you let her." David's eyes dropped to the table, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. "I'm sorry, Mom. I never saw her for who she really was. I'm sorry I let it go this far." But the damage was done. Eleanor didn't need his apologies. She needed action, and she wasn't going to let the past define her future. She turned away from him, her mind already moving forward. The following week, Eleanor took another bold step. Catherine's lawyer, Stephen Bradley, had pushed and pushed, but now it was time for Eleanor to push back. With the new evidence in hand, Robert Kelly filed a motion to dismiss Catherine's claims outright, asking the court to recognize the overwhelming evidence of Catherine's manipulation. The letter, the financial records, the recordings, they were all there for the world to see. The case against Catherine was about to collapse. But as the court date drew nearer, Catherine made one last desperate attempt to salvage her position. Her team approached Robert with a settlement offer, one that would allow her to walk away with a significant portion of the estate in exchange for dropping the lawsuit. The offer was tempting, but Eleanor was resolute. She wasn't interested in settling, not with a woman who had destroyed her family, not with a woman who had taken everything from her and tried to tear it all apart. "I'm not interested in your settlement," Eleanor said to Robert when the offer was relayed. "I want this in court. I want the truth to be heard. I want Catherine to be held accountable for what she's done." Robert nodded, impressed by Eleanor's unwavering stance. "We'll go to court then. It's time we put an end to this." As the days passed, Catherine's desperation became palpable. She began to lash out, trying to discredit Eleanor at every turn, but the public had already made their judgment. The walls were closing in on her. And then, in a final act of defiance, Catherine took the stand. But she wasn't prepared for what came next. Eleanor's legal team had prepared a trap. They presented one final piece of evidence, a hidden video, taken at a party months before Robert's death, in which Catherine had drunkenly confessed to a close friend that her ultimate goal was to secure the entire estate for herself. The courtroom went silent. Catherine's face turned ashen as the video played. The public and the jury watched as Catherine's carefully constructed lies unraveled before them. Eleanor sat back, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The tide had turned, and she had delivered the blow that would end this war. The truth was out. The end was near. But as Catherine's fate hung in the balance, Eleanor's phone buzzed with another notification. A message from David. "I'm done with her, Mom. I'm with you now. I'm sorry I took so long." The battle for the Hughes legacy was nearing its end. But Eleanor knew this was only the beginning of the new life she was about to build. The courtroom was cold, its high ceilings and long, dark wood paneling casting shadows that made the place feel less like a hall of justice and more like an arena, one where only the strongest would survive. Eleanor took a deep breath as she stood at the threshold, her heels clicking on the polished floor as she walked into the space. Each step felt like a weight lifting from her chest, her heart steady despite the looming storm. She had prepared for this moment, fought for it, and now it was time to face her accuser. Catherine, seated on the opposite side, looked as composed as ever, her posture perfect, her hands folded neatly in front of her. But beneath that poised exterior, Eleanor could see the cracks. The facade was beginning to crumble. Catherine's eyes flicked toward her, and for the first time, there was no subtle smile, just a thinly veiled sneer. Eleanor couldn't help but notice how distant David looked as he sat beside Catherine. His eyes were downcast, his attention on his hands, the emotional toll of this war etched into his face. He wasn't the same son she had known. The man sitting in that courtroom was a stranger, torn between his loyalties to his wife and the truth slowly emerging about his mother's fight for justice. The trial began, the gavel striking with authority. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment to make Catherine's lies and manipulation clear for all to see. Catherine's lawyer, Stephen Bradley, opened the case with an emotional plea that immediately sought to paint Eleanor as the villain. His voice was low, filled with calculated sorrow, as he described the grieving widow who had allegedly used Robert's declining health to manipulate him into changing his will. Eleanor Hughes, with her quiet manipulation, convinced a man at the end of his life to rewrite the legacy he had built. She preyed upon his vulnerability, twisted his affection, and took advantage of his kindness, Bradley said, his eyes flicking toward Eleanor as though she were the very embodiment of evil. Eleanor felt a coldness run through her, but she remained motionless. He was attempting to pull the emotional strings of the jury, to make them feel pity for Catherine, but Eleanor knew that the truth wasn't going to be swayed by guilt or sentimentality. The facts, the evidence, they would be her armor. Robert Kelly stood up next, his voice clear and commanding as he began to dismantle the accusations. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the only manipulation here was the one you've heard from Catherine's camp. The facts are simple, and they don't lie. Robert Hughes knew exactly what he was doing when he executed his will. His decision was deliberate, and Eleanor was not only entitled to what she received, she was his rightful heir." Robert's words were like a beacon of light cutting through the murky darkness of lies. The legal team laid out evidence, financial records, bank statements, and recorded conversations, showing Catherine's lavish spending, her attempts to manipulate Robert, and her history of deceit. They even introduced the letter she had written to Robert's business partner, her plans for control laid bare. Every piece of evidence sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and Catherine's carefully constructed defense began to falter. It was Eleanor's turn to take the stand. As she rose, the weight of the room seemed to press down on her, but she held her head high. She had been through hell, and this moment was the culmination of everything she had endured. She had nothing to hide. Eleanor sat down in the witness chair, the quiet murmur of the courtroom dying as she looked at the jury, then at Catherine. She took a steadying breath. "Robert and I had a marriage built on trust and mutual respect," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I never once asked him to change his will. He made that decision on his own, in full clarity of mind. He knew exactly what he was doing." Her words were precise, every syllable carrying the weight of truth. She recounted her life with Robert, the years of partnership, the way they had built their lives together. She spoke of his love for his family, his desire to ensure that his estate was passed on to those who truly mattered to him. And with each word, Eleanor could see the jury's attention sharpen, their skepticism toward Catherine's story growing. Then came the pivotal moment. Eleanor was asked directly about the claim that Robert had been manipulated. She didn't hesitate. "I loved Robert with all my heart. I did nothing to manipulate him," Eleanor stated clearly. "Catherine's accusations are false. The truth is, she's been manipulating everyone around her for years, and now she's trying to destroy me, just as she's tried to destroy everyone else who stood in her way." The room was still for a moment, but the impact of her words hung in the air. She had said it plainly, and there was no turning back now. As she stepped down from the stand, she caught a glimpse of David. His face was pale, his gaze unreadable. But there was something else, something almost imperceptible, shifting in his eyes. The crack in his loyalty to Catherine was widening, the trial stretched on through the day, but the momentum had shifted. Catherine's lies were beginning to unravel, piece by piece. Every time she tried to refute the evidence, she seemed to dig herself deeper into a hole. The jury watched as the veneer of respectability she had so carefully cultivated shattered before their eyes. By the end of the day, the tide had turned firmly in Eleanor's favor. Catherine was losing ground fast, and her once confident demeanor had given way to defensiveness, her arguments weaker and more frantic. She had underestimated the power of truth, the unwavering strength of a woman fighting for everything she had lost. But just as Eleanor felt the tide turn fully in her favor, Catherine's last-ditch attempt to salvage her case took a new form, a personal attack on Eleanor's character. She accused her of orchestrating the entire trial to ruin David's marriage, to break apart their family. "Her sole intention is to destroy everything," Catherine spat, looking directly at Eleanor. "She wants to tear my family apart just to claim what she believes is hers." But as the words left Catherine's mouth, Eleanor saw the truth, the desperate final move of a woman backed into a corner. The courtroom waited for Eleanor's response, and this time Eleanor didn't speak with anger. She simply looked at Catherine, unshaken. "I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here to stand up for what's right." The jury had heard enough. The lies were no longer convincing. And as the gavel came down, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Eleanor knew she had delivered a blow that Catherine could not recover from. But the war wasn't over yet. Tomorrow, the final chapter would be written. The air in the courtroom had shifted. The once subtle tension between the lawyers had become a charged atmosphere, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Catherine's lawyer, Stephen Bradley, had always been the epitome of calm, his demeanor controlled, but now his composure seemed to be slipping. His voice, once smooth and measured, had begun to crack. He was no longer speaking with the confidence of someone who believed in his case. He was grasping at straws. As each new piece of evidence was presented, financial records showing Catherine's lavish spending, hidden assets, and an extensive network of manipulations, the pressure on Bradley grew more apparent. He began to fidget, his hands shifting papers unnecessarily, his eyes darting between the judge, the jury, and Catherine. The cracks in his defense were becoming too wide to ignore. Robert Kelly, on the other hand, stood taller with every passing day. His voice was steady and commanding, and his arguments were airtight. But it was Eleanor's quiet strength that stole the show. She had long been the emotional backbone of this fight, and now, with each shred of Catherine's deceit being exposed, Eleanor's calm resolve was the final blow that the jury could not ignore. Catherine's fortress of lies was crumbling. It wasn't just Catherine's deceitful actions that were under scrutiny now. It was the full extent of the damage she had caused, both to the estate and to David's relationship with his mother. David, who had once stood by Catherine's side so resolutely, was beginning to crack under the weight of the truth. The breakthrough came one evening, after another long day in court. David stood at the edge of the hallway, his hand gripping the doorframe, his face pale. He had been quiet all day, avoiding eye contact with Eleanor, the woman who had always been his anchor. His gaze, once so certain, now seemed unsure, searching for clarity. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, the words coming slowly, as though they had been stuck in his throat for too long. "I didn't see it," David admitted, barely able to meet her eyes. "I didn't see what she was doing to you, to us. I let her pull me away, convince me that you were the one causing all this. But now, I know." Eleanor's heart tightened. There was no anger in her, only a deep, aching sorrow. She had hoped for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to say. What did you say to the son who had betrayed you for so long? What could she say to someone who had been so blinded by his own guilt and love for the wrong person? "I was wrong, Mom," David continued, his voice trembling. "I've been manipulated. I was made to believe that if I just stayed out of it, everything would be okay. But I see now what Catherine has done. I've been blind to it all, and I'm so sorry." Eleanor looked at him, her expression unreadable. The words she'd longed to hear were finally spoken, but they came too late. The damage had already been done. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him. Not yet. Not until he proved he was willing to stand by her, not just in words, but in actions. "I know," Eleanor whispered. "I know." She turned away from him, walking back into the courtroom where the battle was still being waged. No matter what David said now, the fight wasn't over. She had to stay focused. The evidence was on her side. The truth was on her side. And nothing could change that. In the following days, as the trial moved toward its conclusion, Catherine's lawyer continued to flounder. With each new witness, the case against her grew more damning. Eleanor's legal team brought in expert witnesses to validate the legality of Robert's will. These professionals testified that Robert had been of sound mind when he made his decisions, that there had been no coercion, no manipulation. Catherine's last-ditch efforts to claim Robert had been unfit were obliterated under the weight of evidence. Catherine, meanwhile, had grown desperate. Her defenses grew more frantic, and her attempts to settle out of court were rejected outright. She had offered a large settlement at one point, one that would allow her to walk away with a significant portion of Robert's estate. But Eleanor was resolute. She would not settle. Not with someone who had lied, cheated, and tried to tear her family apart. The only thing Eleanor would settle for was justice. But the real turning point came on the final day of the trial. Catherine, visibly shaking, took the stand one last time. Her composure was gone, replaced by a desperate, almost frenzied energy. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to defend her actions. "I never wanted this," Catherine cried out, her voice cracking. "I never meant for it to go this far. I loved Robert, I did. But Eleanor, she's the one who's destroyed everything. She's the one who's torn us apart." Her voice grew louder, more hysterical. She wasn't speaking to the jury anymore. She was speaking directly to Eleanor, trying to make her the villain in this story. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She was calm, centered, even as Catherine's words filled the courtroom with a desperate hysteria. This was Catherine's last attempt to shift the blame, to pin her own guilt on the person who had stood by Robert through everything. And as Catherine's ranting finally slowed, Eleanor stood up. The courtroom grew still as she slowly approached the witness stand, her steps steady. Catherine's eyes widened in disbelief, as if the reality of what was happening was finally sinking in. Eleanor had faced her down time and time again, and now she was walking toward her. Eleanor's voice was quiet, but every word carried the weight of truth. "You've tried to destroy me, Catherine. You've tried to take everything from me, but you can't. You can't take my son. You can't take Robert's legacy, and you won't take what's mine." For the first time, Catherine's confidence shattered. Her eyes flickered with panic as the jury watched, the walls closing in on her. Eleanor had spoken the truth, and now, Catherine had nowhere left to run. The tension in the room was palpable, the shift undeniable. Eleanor had turned the tide, and Catherine's case was now on the verge of collapse. But just as the final gavel seemed ready to fall, a new twist emerged. The storm was far from over. The courtroom was at its boiling point. The final moments of the trial were upon them, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Catherine had given her last desperate performance on the stand, her words tumbling out in a frantic, almost crazed stream, but the damage had already been done. The cracks in her defense were too wide now, too deep to repair. Eleanor had stayed calm, composed, her voice unwavering, and it had worked. The jury had seen the truth, but there was one final piece of evidence left to expose, one last strike. Robert Kelly stood tall before the court, his face set with determination. He wasn't just defending Eleanor now, he was driving a stake into Catherine's heart. The evidence they had uncovered in the final days of the trial was the coup de maître. Robert's hands shook only slightly as he placed a small device on the table in front of him. The courtroom, previously filled with hushed murmurs, fell completely silent. "We've all heard Catherine's story, her accusations against Eleanor," Robert began, his voice firm. "But now it's time to hear the truth, the real truth. The one Catherine doesn't want you to hear." He clicked a button, and the soft hum of a recording filled the room. It was a conversation between Catherine and her lawyer, recorded without her knowledge weeks before the trial began. "I've got to get this will changed. Robert's not in his right mind. He'll listen to me. He'll do what I want." Catherine's voice echoed through the speakers, cold and calculated. "I'll make sure David sides with me. He won't have a choice once we're in control. It's the only way." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Catherine's voice was clear, full of intent, manipulation. Eleanor's hand, which had been steady for days, finally tightened around the arm of her chair. She could hear Catherine's plotting, the plans made at her family's expense, and it hit her like a wave of raw fury. The truth, that thing Catherine had fought so hard to bury, was now on full display for the world to see. Catherine's lawyer, Stephen Bradley, immediately jumped up, his face flushed with panic. "Objection! This recording is inadmissible. It was made without consent, and it's hearsay." But the damage was done. The jury had already heard the words, Catherine's own voice condemning her. The looks on their faces said it all. Shock, disbelief, disgust. They could no longer deny the truth. The judge, his face unreadable, turned to Catherine. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Catherine, her previously unshakable confidence now shattered, opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated. Her throat constricted, her breath shallow. No words came. Her eyes flicked toward David, who had been silent for so long, his expression unreadable. And then, with all the composure of a woman who had lost everything, she tried one last desperate tactic: intimidation. She leaned forward, her eyes dark with defiance, glaring directly at Eleanor. "You think this is over?" she spat, her voice sharp. "I'll make sure you pay for this. You're ruining everything, Eleanor. Your son is mine, and no matter what you think, he'll always be on my side." But Eleanor, standing in the midst of her battle, didn't flinch. Her gaze, steady and unyielding, never left Catherine. "You've already lost," Eleanor said quietly, but the words cut through the courtroom like a sword. "There's nothing left for you to take. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Catherine's face twisted with a mixture of rage and panic, but there was nothing she could do. The jury had seen the truth, heard her own voice reveal her betrayal, and the final blow had been struck. David sat frozen in his seat, his face pale. His hands were clenched in fists, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Catherine. He had tried to ignore the truth for so long, but now it was undeniable. The weight of everything, of the lies, the manipulations, the decisions he had made, came crashing down on him. His mind raced, his heart heavy with regret. As the jury deliberated, Eleanor stood silently, her heart still pounding in her chest. She wasn't celebrating yet. She knew the final verdict hadn't come in, but the truth had won. She could feel it in the air, in the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Catherine's reign of lies was over, and David, her son, had finally seen the reality of the woman he had married. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Catherine's lawyer continued to shuffle papers nervously, trying in vain to salvage what remained of their case, but it was clear. The jury had made up their minds. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the judge called for silence, and the room grew still. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the gavel came down. The jury had reached a verdict. As the judge stood, preparing to announce the decision, Eleanor could feel the tension in the air. This was it. The culmination of everything she had fought for. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment when justice would be served. And in that moment she knew that no matter what the verdict was, her fight was not in vain. She had faced down betrayal, lies, and heartbreak, and now she would walk out of this courtroom with the truth on her side. But as the judge prepared to speak, she couldn't help but wonder, would David finally choose her, his mother, over the woman who had tried to destroy them all? The courtroom held its breath. The courtroom was suffocatingly still. It felt as though time had stopped. The seconds stretching into eternity as the judge rose to deliver the final verdict. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a loud reminder of the battle she had fought and the pain she had endured. She had weathered this storm with nothing but the truth on her side. And now, with the final gavel about to fall, all that mattered was the decision. Catherine, sitting across the room, was a shadow of the woman who had once strode through this courtroom with confidence. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, and her hands, those hands that had once seemed so controlled and poised, were now trembling in her lap. She had tried to manipulate the system, the media, and her family, but in the end, the truth had found its way to the surface. And now, as the silence stretched unbearably long, it was about to bring her world crashing down. The judge cleared his throat, his voice calm and unwavering. The jury has reached a unanimous decision. Eleanor's breath hitched. This was it. On the charge of contesting the will with fraudulent claims, the judge continued, his eyes scanning the courtroom. The jury finds in favor of the defendant, Eleanor Hughes. Catherine Hughes is hereby ordered to pay all legal fees associated with this case. A wave of shock rippled through the room. Eleanor held her breath, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't feel the rush of relief she had imagined, only a deep, overwhelming sense of justice. Catherine's manipulations had been exposed, her lies had been undone, and she had been found guilty in front of everyone. But it wasn't over yet. Catherine's lawyer jumped to his feet in a desperate attempt to salvage something. "Your Honor, we request an appeal. This verdict is—" The judge didn't even let him finish. His voice was firm, the finality of his words echoing through the courtroom. "Motion denied. This trial is concluded." Catherine's face drained of color as the gravity of the decision set in. She slumped back in her chair, her shoulders hunched, her once pristine composure shattered. The courtroom murmurs grew louder, and Eleanor could almost feel the weight of every eye on Catherine as the public verdict settled in. Her reputation, carefully crafted over years, was now in ruins. The whispers were already beginning, the rumors spreading faster than wildfire. Catherine's empire of lies had collapsed, and there would be no coming back from this. Eleanor turned her gaze toward David, but he didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his face a study in conflict. The son who had once been her rock, her support, now seemed like a stranger. The weight of his betrayal, the years of distance, still hung between them like an invisible wall. But there was something else there, too. Something fragile, an acknowledgement that he had been wrong, and that, perhaps, there was a way forward. David lifted his eyes, meeting Eleanor's gaze for the first time in what felt like forever. His voice was soft, hesitant. I'm relieved. It's over. The truth is out." Eleanor felt a pang of bittersweet sorrow as she nodded. Her heart ached for the son she had lost, the one who had been manipulated by Catherine, who had been torn between two worlds. But the world they once had was gone. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologies or reassurances could undo the hurt. "I'm glad the truth has come out, David," Eleanor said, her voice steady but distant. "But there's still a long way to go. I can't just forgive everything. Not yet." David winced, as if her words had struck deeper than he had expected. He opened his mouth to speak again but stopped, unsure of what more there was to say. Eleanor looked away, her eyes drifting back to Catherine, who had now risen to her feet, her face flushed with a mix of rage and humiliation. Her eyes darted from one person to the next, as if she were searching for someone to blame for the destruction of her carefully built life. "You won't get away with this," Catherine spat, her voice trembling with anger. "You think this is over? I'll make sure you regret it." Eleanor's gaze remained unshaken. "You've already lost, Catherine," she said quietly, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You've lost everything, and there's nothing you can do to change that." The courtroom erupted into whispers, and Catherine's face twisted in frustration. She turned to leave, but Eleanor's eyes never left her. Catherine, once so poised, now walked away with nothing but the weight of her defeat. As the gavel fell, marking the official end of the trial, Eleanor's heart felt heavy, but she stood tall, knowing the battle had been won. The court had spoken, but there was no real victory in this. She had lost so much in this fight, her family, her peace, the son she had raised. But in the end, she had held on to the one thing that mattered most: the truth. Outside the courtroom, the media waited. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Eleanor didn't stop. She kept walking, her pace steady, her heart still heavy but resolute. She wasn't sure where her path would lead next, but she knew it was hers to choose. And in that moment, as she stepped into the sunlight, Eleanor knew that she was free. The truth had set her free, and no one, not even Catherine, could take that from her. The aftermath of the trial was like a storm passing through a once peaceful landscape, leaving devastation in its wake. But in the quiet that followed, Eleanor stood, rooted in a place that had been scarred, yet somehow made whole. Catherine's life, once filled with the pretense of perfection, unraveled faster than anyone had expected. Her carefully curated social circle evaporated overnight. The dinner parties, the high society galas, the charmed life she had built, all of it crumbled into dust. Friends who had once fawned over her now kept their distance, exchanging whispers in dark corners of rooms where once her laughter had filled the space. Social media had turned on her like a pack of wolves. What had once been a glossy facade of wealth and elegance now looked like a desperate scramble to maintain control. Catherine's phone, once a constant buzz of business deals and party invitations, fell silent. Her business deals, too, began to falter. Investors pulled out, wary of the tarnished name she now carried, and her once promising ventures began to sink into disarray. For Eleanor, it felt almost anticlimactic. She had won the battle, but there was no gloating, no satisfaction in seeing Catherine fall apart. In truth, the victory had come at a cost, one that Eleanor had never anticipated when she first entered the courtroom. David, on the other hand, had changed, at least outwardly. His earlier detachment, the coolness that had built a wall between them, had begun to dissolve in the wake of the trial's end. He had apologized to Eleanor profusely, his remorse almost painful to witness. His voice, once so confident and distant, now trembled when he spoke to her. "Mom, I was wrong," he had said one evening when he called her. "I can't change what happened, but I need you to know that I see the truth now. I see everything. I see how I've hurt you, how I let her manipulate me. I'm so sorry." The words were hard for Eleanor to swallow, though she knew they came from a place of genuine regret. But even as he expressed his apologies, Eleanor couldn't help but feel the weight of his absence. The years lost to Catherine's influence had left scars that no apology could erase. She found herself unsure about what to do with the words he had given her. "I can't just forgive everything, David," she had told him, the words slipping out more sharply than she intended. "You are my son, and I raised you to know better. But you let her—" "I know," he had interrupted, his voice cracking. "I know. I won't ask you to forgive me, but please, let me try to make it right. Let me help you now." Eleanor had been silent for a long moment before she replied. "I'll meet with you, David. For closure. That's all. But this will take time. And I need to know if you're doing this for yourself, or because you're still trying to fix everything with her. I don't need you to fix anything. I need you to stand with me for once." David had agreed to the meeting, but a part of Eleanor wondered if he truly understood what he had lost. What they had both lost in the aftermath of the war with Catherine. In the days that followed, Eleanor was inundated with media requests. News outlets hailed her as a symbol of strength and resilience, a woman who had stood her ground in the face of betrayal and emerged victorious. Articles were written, interviews were scheduled, and she became a face for those who had been wronged by family members, for those who had suffered in silence. Her newfound attention was both overwhelming and surreal. Eleanor had never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be seen as some kind of hero. She was just a woman who had loved deeply, who had lost deeply, and who, in the end, had fought for the one thing that mattered most: the truth. But now, as cameras flashed around her, Eleanor felt a quiet sense of peace beginning to settle in her heart. She wasn't fighting for anyone's approval anymore. Not Catherine's, not even David's. As Catherine's reputation continued to spiral downward, Eleanor's strength became an inspiration. She was no longer just Robert's widow. She was a symbol of unshakable resilience in the face of betrayal. She became someone people turned to when they needed courage, when they needed to believe that it was possible to rise from the ashes. And as for David, he continued to try. He sent her flowers. He wrote letters. He asked for her time. But each gesture felt like a small attempt to bridge a distance that had become too vast to cross in a single day, or even a year. One evening, after a particularly draining day of interviews, Eleanor sat down alone, staring out at the horizon as the sky turned shades of purple and pink. She felt the weight of the world, of all the years lost, of all the pain, but she also felt something else, something lighter, something that had been buried beneath layers of betrayal and grief. She had found herself again. David's message came through, just like it always did now. I want to rebuild our relationship. I want to make it right. Eleanor stared at the screen for a long time before her fingers hovered over the keys. I'm proud of you, David. But I need time. And you need to show me that you are who you say you are now. It's not about fixing the past. It's about moving forward. She paused, her thumb hovering over the send button. The truth was, she didn't need him to fix anything for her. She didn't need his approval to feel fulfilled. The weight of the years of pain, of betrayal, slowly began to lift as she let go of the burden of needing his validation. When she hit send, there was no relief, but there was a sense of peace. She was no longer defined by the family she had fought for. She was defined by the strength she had found within herself. And as the world around her moved on, Eleanor knew that her journey had just begun. The past was behind her, and the future, that was hers to shape. But as she stood in the quiet of her home, she knew. This was only the beginning. It started with an email. Just another invitation among many that had flooded Eleanor's inbox in the weeks following the trial. At first, she almost deleted it, tired of the media attention and the constant stream of requests. But then her eyes lingered on the subject line: Women's Leadership Summit, Keynote Speaker Invitation. She paused, her hand hovering over the trash icon, then clicked it open. The message inside was brief, yet it struck a chord in her. The organizers of the summit had been following her story. They knew what she had endured: the battles, the betrayals, the fight for justice, and they believed her journey could inspire others. They were offering her a platform to share her story, to speak about resilience, strength, and overcoming adversity. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to stand in front of a crowd, to be seen as a figure of empowerment. But then she remembered everything she had fought for: the truth, her dignity, and the peace she had finally claimed for herself. Eleanor stood before the mirror that morning, the dress she had chosen a simple but elegant navy blue. She took a deep breath and adjusted her posture, straightening her back, just as she had done throughout the trial. The woman in the reflection was different from the one who had walked into that courtroom months ago. She was stronger, more assured, but also softer, having learned to forgive herself along the way. Today, she wasn't the widow of a man whose legacy had been threatened. She wasn't a woman broken by betrayal. Today, she was a voice for others who had suffered in silence, who had been manipulated, controlled, and cast aside. The summit was held in a sleek, modern conference hall, buzzing with the energy of hundreds of women from different walks of life. As Eleanor entered, her presence was magnetic. The media had already labeled her as a symbol of triumph over adversity, and now she was stepping into that role, not as a woman who had suffered, but as a woman who had risen above it all. When it was her turn to speak, Eleanor took the stage with a calm that surprised even herself. The room grew still as she stood at the podium, the spotlight shining down on her. She could hear her own heartbeat in the silence, but she wasn't nervous. She was ready. "I'm not here to talk about my victory in the courtroom," Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here to talk about something far more important: reclaiming your own life, your own voice, and your own worth. I stood in a place where I thought I had lost everything: my family, my peace, my sense of self. But through it all, I found something I didn't even know I had: the strength to fight for what was mine, and the courage to walk away from everything that wasn't." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. There were women of all ages in the audience, some in business suits, others in casual attire, but all of them united by the same hunger for empowerment, for freedom from the constraints that had held them back. Eleanor knew in that moment that her words would matter. They would mean something to someone here. "I was manipulated. I was betrayed. But I didn't let that define me. I chose to rise. And that's the most powerful thing I've ever done." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was quiet. Then, slowly, applause began. Soft at first, and then building into something more. Eleanor smiled, feeling the weight of the applause wash over her. It wasn't for her alone. It was for every woman who had ever been told she was too weak to stand up for herself, too broken to move forward. It was a victory for them all. By the time her speech ended, Eleanor was no longer just a widow or a victim of betrayal. She was a leader, an inspiration. The offers began to pour in. Women in business, aspiring entrepreneurs, and young leaders who had faced their own struggles reached out to her, asking for mentorship, for guidance. She didn't have all the answers, but she had lived through enough to know that the path to healing started with one simple thing: choice. The choice to stop letting the past define you, to take control of your future, and to empower yourself and others to do the same. It was during one of these meetings that Eleanor had a thought that would change everything. What if she could help more women, not just one at a time, but on a larger scale? What if she could create a foundation to help women who had faced betrayal, loss, or manipulation rebuild their lives? By the end of that week, Eleanor had begun laying the groundwork for what would become the Empowerment Foundation. Her mission was simple: to provide women with the resources, mentorship, and support they needed to reclaim their lives, just as she had. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but nothing about her journey had been easy. She was used to fighting for what mattered. As the days passed, Eleanor's story went viral. It wasn't just the media that was telling her story now, it was women everywhere, sharing their own journeys of overcoming adversity. Her message spread far beyond the summit. She became a symbol of resilience, her name synonymous with the strength to rise above whatever life threw at you. But amid all the praise and recognition, Eleanor never forgot what had led her here. She had learned that true empowerment wasn't about accolades or titles. It was about taking back your life, your voice, and your power. It was about knowing that no matter how many times you've been knocked down, you always have the strength to stand up again. And as she looked out over the crowd at her first public event for the Empowerment Foundation, Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning. She wasn't just building a foundation. She was building a movement. A movement of women who would no longer allow their lives to be defined by the hands that tried to hold them back. She was leading that charge, and she would never stop. The final words of her speech echoed in the room. "It's not about what's been taken from us. It's about what we're choosing to build. And together, we will build something unstoppable." The applause that followed was deafening, but it was the sound of something far more powerful, a sisterhood rising. The morning sunlight poured through the windows of Eleanor's office, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. She sat at her desk, a stack of papers before her, but her eyes weren't on the work. She had long stopped looking at the documents that filled her days. No, today she was thinking about the journey that had brought her here. It had been a year since the trial, a year since she had stood in that courtroom, and now her life felt like a dream, one she had built with her own hands. The Empowerment Foundation had exceeded every expectation. What started as a small idea, a way to help women rebuild after betrayal, had transformed into a global movement. Eleanor's story had become a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. Through the foundation, she had connected with hundreds of women who had faced their own hardships, loss, manipulation, abuse, and together, they had started to rewrite their stories. She had always known that what she wanted wasn't just to win in court or take back what was taken from her. What she had wanted was to change the way women saw themselves. She wanted them to see the power in their own voices, the strength in their ability to stand tall, even when the world seemed determined to knock them down. And now, she was seeing it. Women were reclaiming their lives, their futures, and it was the most fulfilling thing she had ever done. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from David. The last few months had been a slow rebuilding process between them, but it wasn't what it used to be. After the trial, he had tried. He had apologized, tried to find a way back into her life, but there was always an underlying tension between them. Eleanor had learned to live without him in the way she once had. She had finally realized that her happiness didn't depend on him, on anyone. I know I can't change the past, but I want to start making things right between us. Please, let me know when you're ready to talk. She stared at the message, her heart heavy but not broken. David's efforts were genuine, but Eleanor wasn't sure what more there was to say. She had long ago accepted that their relationship had been irrevocably altered. Maybe someday, they could find their way back to a new version of their connection. But for now, she didn't need him to feel whole. She had built her own life, one she was proud of. She set the phone down and stood up, walking to the window. Below, the city bustled with the life she had stepped away from when the trial had consumed her. Now, though, the noise felt distant, more like a reminder of what had once been. She had found new freedom, new purpose, in a life she had never imagined for herself. It was a quiet freedom, one that had come not from what she had won, but from what she had let go of. The sound of a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Sophia entered, her face lighting up as she saw Eleanor. The two had stayed close throughout the entire ordeal, and now, Sophia was a key part of the foundation, handling the day-to-day operations. "We just got another grant approved," Sophia said, her voice full of excitement. "It's a huge step forward, Eleanor. I think this could be the push we need to take the foundation to the next level." Eleanor smiled, feeling the weight of the good news settle over her. "That's incredible. It's all coming together, isn't it?" Sophia nodded. "It is. You've done something amazing here, something that will last long after you're gone." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She looked out the window again, letting the truth of Sophia's words sink in. Her greatest success wasn't the money or the recognition. It wasn't even the awards or the media attention that came with the foundation's success. It was the quiet sense of peace that had settled over her life. For the first time in years, she felt at home in her own skin. Later that week, Eleanor received news that Catherine's downfall had reached its final stages. Catherine, unable to pay the mounting legal fees from the lawsuit, had been forced to sell off her assets. What remained of her business empire was unraveling, and her social circle, what was left of it, had turned its back on her. Even those who had once praised her now found themselves publicly distancing themselves from her, unable to associate with the woman who had become a symbol of manipulation and deceit. Eleanor's relief was muted. She didn't need to see Catherine suffer to feel validated. The truth had already been spoken, and Catherine had no power over her anymore. Her mind didn't linger on Catherine's fate, but rather on the new chapter she was writing for herself and for all the women she was helping. As Eleanor walked through her days, she traveled more, meeting with women's groups, speaking at summits, and expanding the foundation's reach. She spent time in places she had once only dreamed of: New York, Paris, London, surrounding herself with people who brought positivity and inspiration into her life. She was no longer bound by the walls of her home, by the legacy of a man or a family that had tried to define her. She had broken free. But what filled her heart the most was the work she did. Helping women who had suffered from betrayal, heartbreak, and manipulation gave her the deepest sense of fulfillment. She wasn't just helping them rebuild, she was helping them recognize their worth. She was empowering them to step into a future that was their own, free from the shadows of their pasts. One night, as Eleanor sat in her quiet home, a thought crossed her mind. It wasn't something she had consciously planned. It just came, unbidden and full of possibility. What if the foundation became a movement? She had never thought of herself as a revolutionary, but perhaps, just perhaps, the work she had started could turn into something far greater. Not just a foundation, but a global network of women who could find their strength in one another. The idea ignited something within her. Eleanor stood, her gaze turning towards the future, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that strange, exhilarating sense of possibility. The life she had built wasn't just hers, it was theirs. A legacy of empowerment, of women who had found their voices, their strength, and their purpose. And as the foundation continued to thrive, Eleanor knew this wasn't just the end of a chapter. This was the beginning of something unstoppable. The evening sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Eleanor's office, casting a golden glow over her desk. She sat back in her chair, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a new email notification flashing across the screen. It was from the Global Women's Rights Coalition. The subject read, "Ambassador Position Invitation." She opened it without hesitation. The email was an invitation for Eleanor to become an ambassador for women's rights on a global scale. It wasn't just an honor, it was a call to action, an opportunity to expand her foundation's impact far beyond what she had imagined, to stand at the forefront of the fight for women's equality worldwide. She read the offer several times, her heart pounding in her chest, and for a moment, she felt the full weight of what she had accomplished, what she could still achieve. She could no longer deny it. She had become a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of resilience and empowerment. Without a second thought, Eleanor hit reply, accepting the position. A few months later, Eleanor stood in front of a crowd of thousands at the International Women's Summit in New York City. The conference hall was a sea of faces, every one of them focused on her. She had been invited to speak as a keynote speaker, and as she walked to the podium, the magnitude of her journey hit her all over again. The woman who had once felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, was now here, on a global stage, speaking not only for herself but for millions of women who had yet to find their voices. "I stand before you today not as a widow, not as a victim, but as a woman who has fought to reclaim her life and her worth," Eleanor began, her voice strong, unwavering. "I know what it's like to feel powerless, to feel as if your world has been taken from you. But I also know what it feels like to fight back, to rebuild, and to stand up for what is rightfully yours. And I am here today to tell you that you have that power within you." The audience erupted into applause. Eleanor could feel the energy in the room, the collective strength of women who were ready to change the world. As she spoke, Her message spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about the obstacles she had faced, but about the resilience that she had found in the most unlikely of places, the depths of despair. Her words resonated with so many, and by the time she left the stage, she knew her influence had grown far beyond her expectations. Her speech had gone viral, shared across social media platforms and news outlets. Eleanor's name became synonymous with empowerment. She was no longer just a figurehead. She was a global leader in the movement for women's rights. The Empowerment Foundation saw an exponential rise in support, donations, and outreach, making a tangible difference in the lives of women across the world. Her voice had been heard, and it had ignited a spark of change that was unstoppable. David reached out again, months after her acceptance of the ambassador position, but this time it was different. His voice was quiet, filled with regret. "I've realized, Mom, that you've built something incredible. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry for everything. I just want you to know that I see it now. And I know I'll never be able to fix everything, but I want to be there for you, however I can." Eleanor read his message several times, her fingers hovering over the keys. She had come to terms with the distance between them, the betrayal that had once cut so deep. But now, she understood that David's growth, his awakening, wasn't for her to judge. It was his journey. She didn't need him to validate her, but she had learned that forgiveness, true forgiveness, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it. She typed a response. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming, David. But I can't go back to what we had. I've found my purpose, and I've found peace. I hope you can find yours too." When she hit send, there was no weight on her shoulders, only clarity. The past was behind her. And the future? It was filled with endless possibilities. Back in the public eye, Catherine's reputation had been reduced to dust. Her businesses had crumbled, her investments fled, and her carefully constructed social persona was in tatters. Every effort she made to salvage her image, public apologies, staged charity events, fell flat, dismissed by the public who had seen her true colors. The media, once her ally, now saw her for what she was, a woman willing to destroy lives for the sake of control. She faded from the public consciousness, her once glittering world now a distant memory. As for Eleanor, her foundation continued to thrive, but it was no longer just about the foundation itself. It was about the women whose lives it touched. It was about a community that had grown so much larger than herself. She had built something real, something that would last long after she was gone. The calls for Eleanor to speak at summits and conferences never stopped. But her life had become more than just public appearances. She traveled, yes, but on her own terms now. No longer chained to the past, Eleanor found joy in the small, everyday moments. The quiet mornings with a cup of tea, the deep conversations with old friends, the satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference. The foundation's reach grew, but so did Eleanor's personal growth. She had built more than a career. She had built a life, one where her worth wasn't defined by anyone else's terms. She was fulfilled, not by validation, but by the simple knowledge that she had done what was right. She had stood for herself, and now she stood for others. One evening, as she walked through a bustling square in London, Eleanor stopped to take in the sights, the lights, the sounds, the life of the city. It was all so new to her now, a world full of opportunity. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely at home in her own skin. No more regrets, no more fear, just a future that was hers to embrace. And as she watched the sunset, she thought, I did it. I built something beautiful. The future was wide open, and it was hers to shape. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor knew she had everything she needed to create the life she had always dreamed of. The years that had passed since the trial felt like a lifetime, Yet somehow, they had flown by in the blink of an eye. Eleanor stood in the quiet of her office, her gaze wandering over the view outside. Another bustling cityscape, this time Paris. The lights of the city stretched far beyond the horizon, just like her journey. It was hard to believe that the woman who had once been abandoned in a cold, unfamiliar mall was now someone who had shaped an entire movement. She had come so far from those painful days, from the betrayal that had broken her heart. Her phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from David. It had been weeks since his last attempt to reconnect. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of regret. Mom, I know I've hurt you. I've apologized, but I'll never stop being sorry for what I did. I just wanted you to know that you're everything I could never be. You've built something beautiful. I'll always love you. Eleanor stared at the message for a long time, her heart strangely quiet. She had heard his words before, repeated, each one trying to bridge the gap he had created. And while a part of her still longed for the son she had lost, she realized that she didn't need his apology to feel whole. She had moved on. His journey was his own, and she had finally made peace with her own. With a deep breath, Eleanor typed a response, her fingers steady. Thank you, David. I'm proud of the man you've become, but I've already found peace. You don't need to fix anything anymore. I'm living the life I've built, and I'm proud of that. She hit send, feeling no weight in her chest, no regret. There was a time when she would have given anything for their relationship to be repaired, but not anymore. She had built her life on her own terms, with or without him. And in that realization, she felt free. Across the world, Catherine had faded into the background of society, a shadow of the woman she had once been. The tabloids no longer printed her name with any reverence, only with a sense of distaste. She had lost everything: her reputation, her wealth, her influence. She was a ghost in the media now, with no one to mourn her downfall. Her businesses were bankrupt, her circle of friends shrank to almost nothing. The woman who had once controlled the narrative now had no power, no voice. Eleanor didn't feel triumphant watching Catherine fall. The victory had already been won in that courtroom, in the quiet strength that had risen within her. The battle was over. What mattered now was the legacy she was building, not the ashes of what others had lost. Her foundation was thriving. The Empowerment Foundation had become a global force, supporting women around the world to rise above the hardships of betrayal, abuse, and manipulation. Eleanor had built it with her own hands, not out of bitterness, but out of the desire to help women find their own voices. The success was overwhelming, and yet, it never felt like work. It was her purpose, her calling. The foundation had expanded into new countries, offering mentorship, legal aid, emotional support, and financial empowerment. Her name was synonymous with strength and resilience. Eleanor had found herself surrounded by a new family, one of mentors, friends, and fellow entrepreneurs who respected her for the woman she truly was. These were the people who saw her not for the victim she once was, but for the leader she had become. She spent her days with them, traveling, speaking, and shaping the future of women's empowerment. She was no longer alone. As the years passed, Eleanor's influence continued to grow. She became a sought-after speaker at global summits, using her platform to advocate for women's rights, gender equality, and the eradication of toxic relationships and manipulation. Her story was shared in classrooms, boardrooms, and online communities across the world. The women who had once been silent were now speaking up, taking control of their lives, their careers, and their futures. They were part of the movement Eleanor had started, a movement she had never intended to lead, but which had found its way to her. But beyond the conferences and the speeches, It was the everyday moments that filled her heart the most. Sitting in her sunlit office, writing letters of encouragement to the women who wrote to her, seeing the small victories that added up to big change, these were the moments that made her life feel complete. Her purpose was not only to inspire, it was to walk beside those who had struggled, offering them the tools they needed to rebuild. One evening, as Eleanor sat in her office, looking over the latest reports from her foundation, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The woman who had once felt abandoned, betrayed, and powerless was now someone who had shaped a legacy of empowerment that would outlive her. The life she had built wasn't just about the wealth or the recognition, it was about the difference she had made in the lives of so many. She closed the report, leaning back in her chair, and let the quiet settle around her. The woman who had been abandoned in a mall, alone and scared, had become a global force for change. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that her greatest success wasn't the fortune she had inherited, the trials she had won, or the fame she had gained. It was the strength to rebuild, to stand firm in her truth, and to create something that would last beyond her. The last few words she had shared at the Women's Leadership Summit echoed in her mind. They thought they could take everything from me, but I built a legacy that no one could ever take away. And as she looked out at the bright lights of the city, Eleanor knew one thing for sure. The future was hers to shape, and she would continue to do so, one woman at a time.